You won't believe this. She stood on my lawn, Mrs. Henderson, HOA president, clutching her clipboard like a scepter, and declared my new cedar fence the one shielding my kids' play area violation of visibility harmony. It had to go. My property, my family's sanctuary, suddenly under siege by a beige tyrant. What she didn't know was that harmony, for me, had a different architect. She wanted visibility? I'd give her a landmark. She wanted a fight? She'd triggered a siege engine fueled by righteous indignation and a deep, abiding respect for city ordinances, properly filed permits, and the sweet, sweet sound of concrete mixers at dawn. The letter arrived a day later. Official HOA letterhead. A crisp, passive-aggressive masterpiece of bureaucratic malice. Dear homeowner. It began as if I were some anonymous cog in her suburban machine. It has come to our attention that the recently erected fence at my address does not comply with Section 4, subsection B, paragraph 3 of the covenants, conditions, restrictions, specifically regarding visibility, harmony, and the approved palette of natural wood stains. My stain, apparently, was too cedary, too vibrant. It clashed with the muted taupe of her soul. My wife, Sarah, read it over my shoulder, her breath catching. Visibility harmony? What in God's name is that? I just shook my head, a cold knot tightening in my chest. This wasn't about a fence, this was about power. Henderson had been president for 5 years, a reign of terror marked by increasingly arbitrary edicts. Last year it was the approved list of mailbox designs, only 3, all hideous, all exclusively sold by her brother-in-law's company. Before that, the precise shade of white for window trims. Now, my fence. The one I'd built myself board by board over 3 weekends, the sun on my back, the kids helping by handing me screws they'd mostly dropped in the grass. It wasn't just wood and nails. It was a boundary, a statement of our small, private world. What are we going to do? Sarah asked, her voice small. I looked out the window at Henderson's perfectly manicured, utterly sterile yard. Her prize-winning roses, undoubtedly sprayed with something that violated at least 3 EPA guidelines, seemed to sneer at me. I'm going to read the rules, I said. All of them. And so began my descent into the HOA's foundational texts, a journey into the heart of suburban darkness. The CCRs were a tome, 100 pages of densely packed legalese designed to crush the human spirit. But I had an advantage. Years ago, before I settled into the quiet life of a software architect, I'd spent a summer working for a municipal planning department, drowning in zoning codes and variance applications. I knew how these documents were constructed, and more importantly, how they could be deconstructed. Visibility harmony, I discovered, was a beautifully vague term, unsupported by any objective criteria. There were no decibel limits for lawnmowers, but God forbid your azaleas were too flamboyant. The section on fences was surprisingly detailed about height, 6 feet max. Materials, wood, vinyl, some approved composites, and setbacks. But it was the omissions that interested me. What it didn't say anything about walls. Not retaining walls, not decorative walls, not structures that served a different primary purpose but happened to also obstruct views. An idea, cold and beautiful, began to form, a structure of pure, unadulterated compliance, a monument to malice, built entirely to code. I pulled out the city zoning ordinances next. They, too, had limits on fences. But again, walls were a different category, especially if they could be argued as part of landscaping or, even better, a detached ancillary structure. The gears began to turn. Sarah found me hunched over the dining table hours later, surrounded by printouts, highlighters, and scribbled notes. Find anything? She asked. I leaned back, a slow smile spreading across my face. Oh, I think so. I think Mrs. Henderson is about to get a masterclass in unintended consequences. The next morning, I called Marcus, an old college buddy. Marcus was a civil engineer, The kind of guy who found beauty in stress tolerances and soil compaction reports. He also had a delightful sense of the absurd. A spite wall? He chuckled, after I laid out the preliminary concept. Against an HOA, Karen? My friend, you are speaking my language. What are the load-bearing requirements for pure, unadulterated righteousness? We talked specs, reinforced concrete, deep footings, 12 feet high, the maximum allowed by the city for certain non-fence structures without a special variance, provided it met structural and setback criteria. It can't be a fence, I emphasized. It needs to be something else. A very tall, very narrow art installation. Or a privacy screen that just happens to be made of enough concrete to stop a tank. Marcus was already sketching. Rebar, number 5, at least. 12 inches on center. We'll need a geotechnical survey, just to be thorough. Can't have your monument to defiance sinking into the clay, can we? The beauty of it was that Henderson's precious visibility harmony was entirely subjective, while concrete strength and city permits were brutally objective. She had picked a fight on my turf, but she didn't realize I was about to change the rules of engagement, using her own rulebook against her. The initial investment would be considerable, but the satisfaction? Priceless. My first act was to send a certified letter to the HOA board, formally requesting clarification on visibility harmony, including any objective metrics, precedents, or approved methods for achieving it. I also asked for the minutes of the meeting where this standard was adopted. I knew they wouldn't have them. It was a bluff, designed to make them scramble, to expose the arbitrariness of their claim. While they flustered, I filed for the necessary city permits. Not for a fence, but for a landscape retaining structure and artistic screen. The city planning office, bless their bureaucratic hearts, cared only about setbacks, height restrictions for that zoning category, drainage, and structural integrity. Aesthetics, beyond basic safety, weren't their purview for this type of construction. Henderson wouldn't know what hit her until the first concrete truck arrived. The war for visibility harmony had begun, and I was bringing heavy artillery. The HOA's response to my certified letter was a masterpiece of evasion. 2 paragraphs of fluff about community standards and aesthetic integrity, signed by Henderson, with no answers to my specific questions. Predictable. Contemptible. It only fueled the engine. Sarah was nervous, naturally. Are you sure about this, honey? It feels extreme. I held her hands. Extreme is demanding I tear down a perfectly good fence that protects our children because it offends her sensibilities. Extreme is wielding petty power to make people miserable. This, I gestured to the growing pile of blueprints and permit applications on my desk. This is a proportionate response. Think of it as educational. The surveyors arrived on a Tuesday. 2 polite men in high visibility vests, planting little flags along my property line, precisely 10 feet inside it, as per city code for the height of the structure I was planning. Henderson was out, watering her roses, of course. She watched them like a hawk, her face a mask of suspicion. I gave her a cheerful wave from my porch. She did not reciprocate. The next day, I began dismantling the cedar fence. I did it slowly, methodically. Each panel removed felt like a small act of defiance. The kids were confused. "Daddy, why are you taking the fence down? Mrs. Henderson doesn't like it." My daughter, Lily, asked, her lower lip trembling. "Sometimes, sweetie," I said, kneeling down, "when someone tries to tell you what you can and can't do on your own property, without a good reason, you have to show them where the real lines are drawn." It was a bit abstract for a 7-year-old, but she nodded. The wood from the fence, I decided, would be repurposed. Some for a new sandbox frame, some for planters. A small symbolic victory. Henderson, emboldened by the sight of the disappearing fence, actually smiled at me from across her yard. A tight, triumphant little smirk. She thought she'd won. "Oh, you sweet summer child," I thought. "You have no idea what's coming." The excavation crew arrived on Friday. A mini excavator, a bobcat, and 3 guys who looked like they ate gravel for breakfast. They started digging the trench for the footings. 12 feet deep in places, reinforced with a cage of rebar that Marcus had specified to withstand a minor earthquake or a direct hit from a rogue garden gnome. The noise was glorious. The rhythmic thump of the excavator, the growl of the bobcat. Henderson's prize roses visibly wilted. She appeared on her porch, phone pressed to her ear, gesticulating wildly. I imagined the conversation. "Yes, operator, I'd like to report an aggressive hole." By midday, the trench was complete. A formidable scar in the earth, a promise of what was to come. Neighbors started to wander by, curious. Old Mr. Abernathy from 3 doors down, a retired carpenter, peered into the trench. "What you buildin', son? Looks serious." "Just a little landscaping feature, Mr. Abernathy," I said with a perfectly straight face. "For privacy," he grunted, a twinkle in his eye. "Privacy, eh? Good an idea as any." He'd had his own run-ins with Henderson over the height of his bird feeder. He knew the score. Sarah brought out lemonade for the crew. Even she was starting to catch the spirit of the thing. "It's bigger than I imagined," she whispered to me, looking at the rebar cages. "That's the point, my love," I replied. Overwhelming, unambiguous presence. The first concrete truck was scheduled for Monday morning, 7:00 a.m. sharp. I'd specifically requested the earliest possible slot. City noise ordinances permitted construction work from that time. I imagined Henderson, jolted awake by the roar of the diesel engine, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the concrete pump. The thought was deeply satisfying. On Sunday evening, I sat on my porch, enjoying the temporary openness where my fence once stood. Henderson was also on her porch, a smug look still plastered on her face. She was probably already planning what new foliage she'd demand I plant to further enhance her view. I raised my glass of iced tea to her in a silent toast. To harmony, Mrs. Henderson. My version of it. The stage was set. The permits were posted, clearly visible, on a temporary hoarding. Every I dotted, every T crossed. Let the games, or rather, the pouring, begin. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about drawing a line in the, well, soon-to-be concrete. The first concrete truck arrived precisely at 700 hours. Its reverse beeper, a clarion call to battle. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, a rather ironic backdrop for the gray wave about to be unleashed. Henderson's bedroom window, the one directly facing my property line, remained dark for all of 3 minutes. Then a light flicked on. I could almost feel the vibrations of her outrage from across the yard. The concrete pump, a magnificent articulated beast, extended its boom over the trench. The crew, already caffeinated and ready, guided the nozzle. The first slurry of gray gold began to flow, filling the deep footings, encasing the steel bones of the rebar cage. It was a beautiful sight, poetic in a brutalist sort of way. By 7:30 a.m., Henderson was on her lawn, clad in a fluffy pink bathrobe, her hair in disarray. Her face was a study in apoplectic disbelief. She was shouting something, but the glorious roar of the truck and the pump drowned her out. It was like watching a silent movie, a comedy of impotent fury. I sipped my coffee from my porch, offering a polite nod. She jabbed a finger towards the construction, then towards me, her mouth forming words I could only assume were not compliments. A second truck arrived as the first was emptying. Then a third. Marcus hadn't skimped on the concrete. This foundation wasn't going anywhere. By mid-morning, the footings were poured. The crew smoothed the top, ready for the forms that would define the wall itself. Henderson had retreated, presumably to call every city official, lawyer, and possibly the National Guard that she could think of. The phone calls started around 10:00 a.m. First, a rather confused clerk from the city planning department. "Mr. Davies, we've had a complaint about unpermitted construction at your address." "Oh, really?" I said, feigning surprise. "But my permits are posted clearly on site. Permit number 74B/9 Alpha for a landscape retaining structure and artistic screen. Approved last Tuesday." A pause. The rustling of papers. "Ah, yes, I see it here. My apologies, Mr. Davies. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. Click. Next was a call from a junior associate at the HOA's law firm, a young man who sounded like he was still in law school. Mr. Davies, I'm calling on behalf of the Covenants Committee. We understand you are erecting an unapproved structure. Unapproved by whom? I asked. The city permits are in order. And as for the HOA, I'm still awaiting clarification on visibility harmony from Mrs. Henderson. Perhaps you could provide that? In writing, of course. He stammered something about CC, rupees, and community standards. I cut him off. Unless you can cite a specific, unambiguous clause in the CC rupees that this fully permitted structure violates, I suggest you advise your client to enjoy the show. Or perhaps invest in taller rose bushes. Click. The forms for the wall itself went up the next day. 12 feet of solid, imposing plywood, braced and staked. It looked like a medieval siege work. Neighbors paused on their morning walks, their expressions a mixture of awe and trepidation. Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street gave me a thumbs up. Her son had been fined for leaving his bicycle on their own driveway overnight. She was clearly enjoying the spectacle. Henderson, meanwhile, had escalated to taking photographs. She lurked behind her curtains, occasionally darting out to snap pictures with her phone, like a highly irritable spy. I made sure to smile and wave every time I saw the lens pointed my way. The concrete pour for the wall itself took another full day. More trucks, more noise, more beautiful, beautiful concrete. As the forms were filled, the sheer scale of it became apparent. This wasn't just a wall, it was a statement. A 12-foot high, 50-foot long, 2-foot thick Declaration of Independence. When the forms were finally stripped away a few days later, after the concrete had cured to a steely hardness, it was magnificent. A brutal, elegant monolith of defiance. It cast a very long shadow, particularly over Henderson's prize-winning petunias. It's impressive, Sarah admitted, standing beside me, looking up at the towering expanse of gray. It's certainly visible, I said, and I think it harmonizes beautifully with my desire not to be bothered. The first official HOA notice regarding the wall arrived via certified mail. Demand for immediate cessation of unapproved construction and removal of non-compliant structure. It cited a new emergency resolution passed by the HOA board, Henderson, her treasurer crony, and the bewildered secretary, declaring monolithic concrete structures to be out of character with the neighborhood. Cute, I murmured. But an emergency resolution can't retroactively apply to a fully permitted and already constructed edifice. Amateur hour, Henderson. Amateur hour. I filed it neatly with my other documents. The wall was up. Stage 1 complete. Now, for the embellishments. Henderson thought the concrete was the problem. She hadn't even begun to understand the scope of my vision for neighborhood beautification and community engagement. The floodlights were next. Industrial grade, LED, capable of turning night into a very localized, very bright day. I had them installed on sleek steel poles, bolted directly into the top of the wall, angled slightly downwards to illuminate its glorious textured concrete face, and, incidentally, the first 10 feet of my yard. They also, quite unintentionally of course, cast a significant amount of ambient light towards Henderson's property. For security, I explained to a curious Mr. Abernathy, who was practically living on my sidewalk now, chronicling the saga. And to properly display public art. The first time I switched them on, just after dusk, it was like a scene from a sci-fi movie. The wall leaped out of the darkness, a stark, imposing presence. From Henderson's house, there was a shriek, followed by the frantic drawing of curtains. I imagined her, pupils contracting, muttering about light pollution and the general decline of civilization. The HOA fines started arriving with daily regularity. $50 for unapproved structure, another $50 for aesthetic nuisance, $100 for failure to comply with previous notices. They were piling up on my desk. A colorful testament to Henderson's impotent rage. I treated them like fan mail, filing them meticulously. Then came the first ad. I debated starting subtle, but where was the fun in that? My friend Marcus had put me in touch with a guy named Leo, who ran a small, slightly disreputable digital advertising company. Leo loved the concept. Malicious compliance advertising? Sign me up. The sheer pettiness is art, man. For the initial display, we went with a projection system. High-powered, weatherproof, capable of throwing a crisp image onto the concrete. The first ad, unveiled on a Friday night, was for Brenda's brisket, so good it'll make you slap your HOA president. It featured a picture of a succulent, dripping slice of brisket. Brenda was a friend of Leo's who ran a food truck. She was thrilled with the exposure. The reaction from Henderson's house was immediate. Lights flicked on and off. I saw her silhouette pacing furiously behind her drapes. The next morning, a new fine. Unauthorized commercial activity. $200. I sent Leo a text. Phase 2. The ads began to rotate. Grumpy Gus's discount mufflers. Will silence your engine, unlike some neighbors. Then, the law offices of Ripu Daman Singh, fighting for your rights, especially against tyrannical HOAs. That one got a cease and desist letter from Henderson's lawyers within hours, hand-delivered by a very nervous courier. I framed it. The pièce de résistance, however, was the camera. A small, weatherproof dome camera, installed discreetly on the top edge of the wall, overlooking my own property, of course. For security. It just so happened to have a rather wide-angle lens that captured a lovely panoramic view of the top of the wall, my back garden, and, purely coincidentally, a sliver of Henderson's meticulously maintained, yet perpetually empty back patio. And on the wall, near a particularly inviting ledge, I'd installed a small, attractive bird feeder and a nesting box. Leo helped me set up a live stream. Henderson Heights Aviary Cam, watch a bird, not your neighbor. It featured a gentle ambient soundtrack of birdsong. Within a day, a family of sparrows had moved into the nesting box. The live stream viewership was modest but enthusiastic, particularly among certain disgruntled residents of our subdivision. Henderson's next missive was practically vibrating with fury. It accused me of harassment, invasion of privacy, despite the camera pointing primarily at my own land and a public-facing area of hers, and intentional infliction of emotional distress through ornithological exhibitionism. That last one was my favorite. I was starting to think Henderson was moonlighting as a comedy writer. She's losing it, Sarah said, watching me catalog the latest find. This is beyond anything I imagined. She drew first blood, Sarah, I reminded her gently. She tried to dictate how we live on our own land, based on a whim. This wall, these ads, they're just her whim, reflected back at her, magnified by the beautiful, immutable laws of physics and municipal code. The threats of legal action from the HOA became more strident. They were now talking about liens, forced compliance, court orders. I consulted with a lawyer friend, a sharp woman named Tanya who specialized in property disputes and relished a good David and Goliath story. Tanya reviewed my documentation, the permits, the CCRs, Henderson's increasingly unhinged correspondence. She doesn't have a leg to stand on regarding the wall itself, Tanya said, a grin playing on her lips. It's permitted. It's on your property. It meets code. The ads are pushing it, but commercial activity in the CCRs is probably aimed at running a business from your home, not renting out passive display space on a structure. The camera is iffy if it's genuinely perceived as targeted, but the aviary cam angle is genius. It's all about plausible deniability and her escalating irrationality. Tanya suggested my next move. Bill them, for ad revenue. Send the HOA an invoice. Since they are so clearly engaging with and monitoring the commercial display, they're deriving benefit. Or, alternatively, bill them for the targeted advertising campaign you're running on their behalf, bringing attention to HOA governance. Frame it as a service. The sheer audacity of it appealed to my soul. The wall was no longer just a defensive structure, it was becoming a revenue stream, courtesy of Henderson's obsession. The invoice to the Henderson Heights Homeowners Association, C.O. President Karen Henderson, was a thing of beauty. I itemized it carefully. Wall space prime advertising rental. West face. Premium Illumination Package. 500 week. Content Engagement Monitoring Services, as evidenced by daily fines and correspondence. 200 week. Special curated advertising campaign to enhance HOA visibility and community discussion. Ref. Divorce Lawyers, Muffler Repair, Brisket. 300 week. Total due, $1,000, payable within 30 days. I sent it via certified mail, with a copy to their lawyer. The silence that followed was profound. For nearly 48 hours, no new fines, no irate calls, no curtains twitching. It was the calm before the storm, I suspected. Henderson was probably consulting with her lawyers, who were likely advising her that she was navigating a minefield of her own creation. Sarah was starting to find the whole thing hilarious. "You build them? You actually build the HOA?" she asked, laughing, until tears streamed down her face. "They seem very interested in my wall," I said deadpan. "It's only fair they contribute to its upkeep and appreciate its commercial potential." The ads continued their rotation. We added one for a local pet adoption agency. Adopt a friend, they're less judgmental than your neighbors. And another for a landscaping company specializing in privacy hedges and tall, view-obscuring shrubbery. Leo was having the time of his life, sourcing increasingly pointed, yet technically anodyne, advertisements. The Henderson Heights aviary cam was a quiet hit. The sparrows were thriving. We even got a few comments on the livestream chat from people in other states, offering advice on birdseed. One viewer from Arizona said, "Love the wall. Wish I had one to keep my nosy HOA prez out of my birdwatching." It was becoming a small, bizarre online community. The HOA's legal response, when it finally came, was a sputtering, indignant letter threatening a lawsuit for frivolous and vexatious billing, continued violation of community standards, and operation of an unauthorized commercial billboard. They demanded the immediate removal of the wall, the cessation of all advertising, the dismantling of the camera, and a public apology. Tanya read it with delight. "Oh, this is rich. They're on the ropes. Frivolous and vexatious billing? That's what they do with their fines. Unauthorized commercial billboard? Is it a billboard or an artistic screen displaying sponsored content? The definitions matter." She advised a counteroffer. "We'll offer to mediate, but our starting position is the wall stays, the ads stay, perhaps with some mutually agreed, upon community standards for content, which we can negotiate endlessly, and the camera stays, as it's for security. In return, you drop all fines and issue a formal apology for the initial harassment regarding the cedar fence." It was a bold move, essentially offering them a chance to surrender gracefully. I doubted Henderson's ego could handle it. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was stirring. My little rebellion had not gone unnoticed. Other residents, long cowed by Henderson's iron fist, started to emerge. Mr. Abernathy was now holding impromptu court on his porch, discussing property rights and the limits of HOA power. Mrs. Rodriguez had successfully contested her son's bicycle fine, citing selective enforcement and lack of clearly posted regulations. Small cracks were appearing in Henderson's beige empire. The pressure was building, not just from my concrete monolith, but from within the community she purported to lead. Her power was derived from perceived authority and the silent acquiescence of the residents. My wall was a 12-foot-high, floodlit, advertising-plastered symbol that her authority was not absolute. The next HOA newsletter, usually a bland affair full of reminders about lawn maintenance and upcoming potlucks, contained a thinly veiled, frantic diatribe from Henderson about rogue elements and the importance of upholding community values against disruptive influences. It didn't mention me by name, but everyone knew who she meant. It backfired spectacularly. Instead of rallying support, it just made her look desperate and unhinged. The comments on the neighborhood Facebook group, which Henderson usually policed with an iron fist, deleting anything remotely critical, were brutal. What values? The value of fining kids for riding bikes? Disruptive-like. Building a perfectly legal structure on your own property? Maybe the rogue element is the one who thinks visibility harmony is a real thing. The tide was turning. Henderson had overplayed her hand, and the wall was the fulcrum upon which her power was breaking. The beauty of it all was that I hadn't broken a single rule. Every action was calculated, permitted, and documented. She was fighting a ghost, a reflection of her own arbitrary pronouncements, now made manifest in 50 tons of concrete and steel. The call for the emergency HOA meeting came via a hastily printed flyer stuffed into mailboxes. Urgent community forum. Preserving our neighborhood integrity. It was scheduled for a Wednesday evening in the clubhouse, a cramped, soulless room usually reserved for bunco nights and Tupperware parties. This, I knew, was Henderson's last stand. She intended to rally the homeowners, paint me as a villain, and pressure the board, which was essentially her, into taking more drastic legal action. Tanya and I prepared. We had copies of every permit, every ordinance, every piece of correspondence, neatly organized into binders. We also had a PowerPoint presentation. Tanya loved a good PowerPoint. "We're not just going to defend," she said, her eyes gleaming. "We're going to countersue for harassment and abuse of process if they push this. We'll show them the cost of her vendetta." Sarah decided to come, a show of quiet solidarity. Even Mr. Abernathy and Mrs. Rodriguez said they'd be there, along with a surprising number of other neighbors who had privately expressed their support. The clubhouse was packed. Henderson sat at the head table, flanked by her 2 loyal board members, looking grim. She opened the meeting with a 20-minute tirade about the sanctity of community standards, the threat posed by uncooperative individuals, and the monstrosity that had blighted our beautiful neighborhood. She was practically quivering with indignation. She showed blurry photos of my wall, taken from her bedroom window. She read aloud the fines she'd issued, as if they were badges of honor. She spoke of visibility harmony with the fervor of a prophetess. When she finally finished, red-faced and panting, there was a strained silence. Then Tanya stood up. "Mrs. Henderson," she began, her voice calm and clear, "you've made a lot of accusations. Perhaps we can look at some facts." And with that, she launched the PowerPoint. Slide 1. A high-resolution photo of the city. Approved permit for the landscape retaining structure and artistic screen. Slide 2. The relevant sections of the city zoning code, highlighting the legality of the structure's height and setbacks. Slide 3. The HOA's CCRs, with the definition of fence, clearly distinct from wall or ancillary structure. She then addressed visibility harmony. "Mrs. Henderson, in response to Mr. Davies' formal request for clarification, you provided no objective definition for this term. Could you, perhaps, provide one now? Or cite the specific bylaw that codifies it with measurable standards?" Henderson sputtered. It's about the overall aesthetic. What's pleasing to the eye." "Whose eye, Mrs. Henderson?" Tanya pressed. "Yours. Because it seems Mr. Davies' structure is quite pleasing to the sparrows on the Henderson Heights aviary camp, which, by the way, has a very loyal following." A few chuckles rippled through the room. Tanya moved on to the ads. "The CCRs restrict operating a business from one's home. Mr. Davies is not operating a business. He is leasing display space on a structure on his property, much like one might lease mineral rights. Is there a specific bylaw prohibiting this that isn't vague or overly broad?" More sputtering from Henderson. Then Mrs. Rodriguez stood up. "Mrs. Henderson, you fined my son for leaving his bicycle on our driveway for 2 hours. You told Mr. Peterson his wind chimes were too loud, even though they're barely audible from the sidewalk. You told the Chang family their welcome mat was ethnically inappropriate. When does it stop?" The room erupted. One by one, other homeowners stood up, sharing their own stories of Henderson's petty tyranny, her arbitrary enforcement of unwritten rules, her dismissive attitude. It was an outpouring of years of frustration. Henderson looked stunned, then furious, then something close to terrified. Her carefully constructed facade was crumbling. Her power base, built on intimidation and the assumption of compliance, was dissolving before her eyes. Mr. Abernathy, his voice surprisingly strong, said, "This ain't about a wall, Karen. This is about you treating us like your personal serfs. This young man, he gestured to me. He just had the guts and the know-how to fight back with your own rulebook. Tanya delivered the final blow. Mrs. Henderson, Miss Davies is prepared to discuss a resolution. However, given the clear evidence of targeted harassment and the financial and emotional distress caused, if the HOA pursues any further action against him regarding this fully compliant structure, we will be filing a countersuit seeking damages and your immediate removal from the board for malfeasance and breach of fiduciary duty. The threat hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The other two board members looked pale. They exchanged nervous glances. They knew. Henderson knew. It was over. The vote of no confidence in Henderson as president was proposed by the board treasurer himself, a man who had clearly seen the writing on the wall, and perhaps the ads on mine. It passed almost unanimously. Henderson sat there, defeated, her face ashen. The reign of beige was at an end. The aftermath was surprisingly swift. Henderson resigned from the HOA board entirely the next day, citing personal reasons. Her house went up for sale 2 weeks later. Rumor had it she was moving to a condo association with even stricter rules, presumably one where she wasn't in charge. The HOA, under new, more reasonable leadership, Mr. Abernathy was interim president, much to everyone's relief, officially dropped all fines against me, and issued a formal apology for the misunderstanding regarding the cedar fence. They even offered to pay for its reinstallation. I politely declined. The wall was rather growing on me. Tanya and I negotiated a settlement regarding the advertising. The HOA agreed to a modest sponsorship of the community art installation, enough to cover the electricity for the floodlights and the birdseed for the Henderson Heights aviary camp. In return, the ads became more community-focused. Announcements for local school events, lost pets, neighborhood watch meetings. Leo was a little disappointed by the taming of his creative canvas, but he understood. The war was won. Now it was time for peace. A peace dictated by 12 feet of concrete. The camera remained, now officially part of the Neighborhood Safety and Ornithological Observation Program. The sparrows successfully raised their first brood. The livestream occasionally featured a passing raccoon or an owl, much to the delight of its viewers. My neighbors, emboldened by Henderson's downfall, began to reclaim their little patches of suburban sovereignty. A rogue pink flamingo appeared on Mrs. Rodriguez's lawn. Mr. Peterson rehung his wind chimes, which now seemed to play a cheerful, defiant tune. The visibility harmony that Henderson had so desperately sought was replaced by a more authentic, slightly chaotic, but ultimately more human, tapestry of individual expression. My wall stood as a silent testament to that, a monument not to spite, though that had certainly been a component of its genesis, but to the principle that a person's home is their castle, even if that castle has a 12-foot concrete boundary and occasionally advertises discount brisket. Sarah and I often sat on our porch in the evenings, the wall softly illuminated behind us, casting a gentle glow. You know, she said one night, I kind of like it. It feels safe. And it did. It was a tangible boundary, a declaration that this space was ours, protected not just by concrete and steel, but by the will to stand up to petty tyranny. The final ad I commissioned, before handing over creative control to the new HOA committee, was simple. A black background, white text. Harmony is letting your neighbors live in peace. This message brought to you by the Davies family and a whole lot of rebar. Sometimes, I'd catch a glimpse of the new owners of Henderson's old house. They seemed nice. They planted a vegetable garden and let their kids draw with chalk on the driveway. They never once complained about the wall. In fact, the husband once told me he thought it was pretty cool, in a brutalist sort of way. He asked if he could borrow my plans. I just smiled. The legacy of the wall wasn't just the structure itself, but the understanding that sometimes, to protect your peace, you have to be willing to pour some concrete, metaphorically or, as in my case, very, very literally. And as for visibility harmony, I achieved it. From my yard, Henderson was no longer visible, and that, I found, was the most harmonious view of all. The experience taught me that rules and regulations, so often wielded as instruments of oppression by those who crave control, can also be tools of liberation if you understand their architecture. The system designed to confine can also, with meticulous effort and a touch of audacious creativity, be made to serve justice. Henderson wanted a clear line of sight. I gave her an unyielding boundary. She sought to impose her will. I showed her the limits of her power, etched in stone and illuminated for all to see. The neighborhood breathed easier, a little less beige, a little more alive. And it all started because of a cedar fence and a misplaced belief in something as nebulous as visibility harmony. The irony was, in the end, quite beautiful.